He thought it would be the easiest job of his life. A single mother, so thin that her collarbones pushed against the neckline of her shirt, working 2 shifts every day just to keep the power from being shut off in a miserable apartment. A 6-year-old daughter in a wheelchair, her legs unable to carry her, her speech slow, the whole world looking at her with pity in their eyes, except for one dog. That dog weighed 65 kilograms, a purebred Neapolitan Mastiff, its face wrinkled and fearsome like something out of hell. Yet every morning it used its massive head, big as a pillow, to push the little girl's wheelchair to school. It was the legs she didn't have. It was the only thing in this world that had never looked at her with pity. And he, the little girl's biological father, the man who had beaten her mother throughout the pregnancy and then walked away the moment he saw that his child couldn't walk, came back 7 years later. Not because he missed his daughter, but because that purebred dog was worth $45,000, and he owed almost exactly that amount. He brought his younger brother, 2 other men, and a stack of forged papers claiming the law was on his side. He snatched the dog away in the middle of the street, in broad daylight, right in front of the little girl. The child didn't scream. She didn't cry out loud. Her body cried by trembling from her shoulders to the tips of her fingers, in silence, without making a sound at all, and he saw it. Saw what it did to her. And then he laughed. What he didn't know, what would have kept him from ever setting foot in this city again if he had known, was that 3 blocks north, inside a black sedan, parked on a street corner, there was a man listening to everything. That man wasn't a cop, wasn't a lawyer, wasn't the hero from any fairy tale. He was the mafia boss who controlled the entire southern half of the city, a widower for 3 years, cold as steel, and he had never forgotten that 7 years earlier, that same gaunt young mother, only 20 years old then, pregnant, her face still bruised from being beaten, had looked straight into a police camera and said 3 words that saved him from 25 years in prison. I didn't see anything. She didn't know who she was saving. She only wanted to get out of the police station and go home. He had never forgotten, and he had searched for her for 7 years. He thought he'd come to steal a dog. He didn't know that he had just stepped into the devil's territory, and the devil had awakened. This story is long, and every part that comes after this will be heavier than the one before. So if you want to hear more, leave a like so I'll know. Share this video with one friend who needs to hear this story tonight. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the moment, because the next part is one you won't want to miss. At 5:45 in the morning, the 3rd-floor apartment in Southridge was still dark. Briar Holloway opened her eyes before the alarm clock had the chance to ring, like she did every day, like every morning for the past 6 years, because her body had learned that 5 extra minutes of sleep meant losing 5 minutes to get Posey ready. And losing 5 minutes to get Posey ready meant missing the bus. And missing the bus meant being late for the morning shift. And being late for the morning shift meant losing her job. That chain of falling dominoes left no room for laziness. She sat up in the dark, her feet touching the cold floor, and the first thing she heard wasn't the city waking outside. It was breathing. Heavy, steady, slow. A massive mountain of fur and muscle lay stretched out on the floor between Posey's bedroom door and the hallway, in the exact spot where he'd slept every night for 4 years, never once missing, never needing to be told. Brutus didn't move when Briar stepped past him, but his ears turned with her footsteps, tracking her through the darkness by the hearing of a creature that had memorized every sound this apartment could make. The kitchen was small. The fluorescent light flickered twice before it finally came on, the bulb nearly dead, and she still didn't have the money to replace it. She opened the refrigerator, and inside everything was arranged with the precision of someone counting every dollar. Enough milk for 4 days. 6 eggs left. Cheese already sliced into even portions for Posey's breakfasts all week long. Nothing extra, nothing missing. Briar made coffee from the cheapest brand in the grocery store, the kind she knew didn't taste good. But Posey had never once complained about the smell of her mother's coffee, because to Posey that smell was the smell of morning, the smell of her mother being here, the smell that meant everything was still all right. She set the cup down and went into Posey's room. The little girl was already awake, 6 years old, with messy brown hair and gray-blue eyes like her mother's, lying there and staring at the ceiling with the solemn expression of a child thinking about something very serious. At some point, Brutus had gotten to his feet without Briar even noticing. He walked into the room and used his broad, heavy skull, a massive, warm weight, to push the wheelchair from the corner of the wall up against the bed. His job every morning. No one had taught him, No one had trained him. He simply understood, in the way creatures living beside pain long enough begin to teach themselves what must be done. Briar lifted Posey into the wheelchair, dressed her, tied back her hair. Every movement was exact, practiced, without a single second wasted. Because wasted seconds were a luxury life had never offered her. Posey placed her left hand on Brutus's head when the wheelchair began to roll toward the door, and her right hand gripped the side of the chair. Her left hand wasn't there to pet him. It was her rail, her compass, the way she knew she wasn't moving through the world alone. The vibrations from Brutus's footsteps traveled through the rotting wooden floor, into the worn wheelchair wheels, into the left wheel that was a little loose, and that Briar had tightened herself with screws bought from a salvage shop, through the metal frame, into the palm of Posey's hand. The walk to school was 4 blocks long. Posey didn't see the world the way other children did. She saw it from the height of grown people's hips, from the eye level of a wheelchair, where the world was made of shoes and pant legs and wheels and table legs. She recognized the neighbors not by their faces but by the way they walked. Mrs. Yoon from the vegetable store was blue house slippers, short steps, the smell of basil, and every morning she slipped an apple into Posey's hand and never once charged for it. The old man on the corner was cracked heel boots, cigarette smoke, heavy footsteps. The paper boy was sneakers with the soles worn thin, running fast, the smack of newspapers hitting doors. Every Tuesday morning, Posey's world was measured by the tremor of the pavement rising through the wheelchair wheels into her bones, by the smell of bread drifting from the bakery on the second corner, by the hiss of the number 7 bus braking at the stop at 8:43, and by the warm, steady, unchanging pressure of Brutus's head beneath her left hand. He walked beside the wheelchair, shoulder brushing the frame, moving slowly enough to match the pace of Briar pushing from behind. 65 kilograms of wrinkled-faced dog, drool hanging from his mouth, looking like something dragged out of another person's nightmare. But to Posey, he was the most beautiful thing on this street, the only creature in existence that saw her as whole, never once focusing on the legs that didn't work. Mrs. Yoon stood in front of her vegetable shop, pressed a red apple into Posey's hand, and said something in Korean laced with English that Posey didn't completely understand, but understood enough, because the woman's voice was always warm. Briar nodded her thanks, pushed the wheelchair on, and the morning kept unfolding the way it had every day, ordinary enough to seem almost invisible, peaceful enough that no one would have believed it could break, fragile enough that all it would take was one hand reaching out from the past to bring everything crashing down. It was the last morning before anything was ever whole again. The morning shift at the diner started at 6:30, and Mrs. Pham had already been in the kitchen long before that, small and wiry in her grease-stained apron, her eyes sharp as box cutters, the kind of eyes worn by someone who'd lived long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. That day she didn't stay silent. Briar had barely hung her apron on the hook when Mrs. Pham was suddenly beside her, voice low and quick, not looking at Briar's face at all, but out through the glass door as though she were speaking to somebody else. "A blonde guy came asking about you yesterday. Smiled too much. Asked what shift you work, where you live, and what kind of dog you've got that's so damn big. I told him I didn't know, but you ought to know I don't like men who smile too much." Briar didn't answer. Her hand was wrapped around the frying pan, and that hand tightened until her knuckles went white, because her body remembered before her mind had the chance to think. Her body remembered blonde hair. Her body remembered that smile. Her body remembered the feeling of that hand on her throat, not squeezing, only resting there, lightly, just enough for her to know it could close at any moment. And that light touch was more terrifying than any punch, because it said he controlled her completely, and he wanted her to know it. 7 years had passed, and still her body remembered. Her hands still turned cold without warning. Her heart still pounded in her throat, instead of her chest. Her instincts still wanted to make herself small, vanish into the wall, become something too tiny to be found. She didn't tell Mrs. Pham who he was. She only nodded and turned back to the stove, and the pan in her hand grew hotter while her fingers stayed cold through the entire shift. That afternoon, she picked Posey up from school. Brutus stood beside the wheelchair as he always did, his head level with Posey's hand, his tail wagging slowly when he saw Briar, and everything looked normal until Posey spoke in that soft voice of a child, telling a story she doesn't yet know is important. "Mama, there was a man standing by the school fence. He looked at Brutus for a really long time, longer than people usually look." Briar stopped walking. Her hand on the wheelchair handle didn't tighten the way it had around the frying pan, but it went rigid in a different way, the way a person holds herself steady so her child won't see her shake. She asked what he looked like, and Posey thought for a moment, then said he was smiling. But he didn't look at Brutus the way people look when they like dogs. He looked the way people look at things in store windows. 6 years old. 6 years old. And the truth of that sentence was so exact, it made Briar want to sit down right there on the sidewalk and cry. But she didn't sit down. She pulled Brutus closer, pushed the wheelchair faster, and took a different route home, her chest heavy with the thing she'd thought she'd buried 7 years ago. Memory didn't come back in order. It came back in shards, his hand on her throat in the kitchen of the old apartment. The sound of her crying while he didn't hear, because he was watching football. The sound of Posey, newly born, crying inside the hospital incubator, crying the way premature babies cry, weak and hurried and full of fragile life. And Briar, 20 years old, standing alone at the hospital front desk, signing the discharge papers with her right hand because her left arm was bruised from the wrist to the elbow, and not one person came to pick her up, and not one person asked what had happened to her arm. She carried her daughter out through the hospital doors with one good arm and stepped into a world where nobody was waiting outside. 7 years ago, she had walked through those doors alone. 7 years later, he was standing at her daughter's school fence, smiling, looking at her daughter's dog with the cold, appraising eyes of a man putting a price on something. She didn't know he had come back. But someone else did. The night shift started at 8 o'clock. Briar changed out of her diner apron and into her cleaning uniform, caught the bus for 14 blocks to the commercial building in downtown Baltimore, where she worked from 8 until midnight, 4 nights a week, alone. Posey stayed home with Brutus, 6 years old, in a wheelchair, and a 65-kilogram dog. That was Briar Holloway's childcare system. Not ideal, but it was what she had. The building was 14 stories tall, all glass on the outside, full of people during the day, and empty at night in the way commercial buildings are empty. Footsteps echoing down long hallways, half the corridor lights shut off to save electricity, and that feeling that every floor was its own separate world, one that didn't belong to anyone after dark. Briar cleaned from the 14th floor down, 1 hour per floor if she moved quickly, an hour and 15 if there was a large conference room. She wore earbuds, played music low, just enough so she wouldn't have to hear the silence of the building, and pushed her cleaning cart through each hallway, with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this long enough that her hands already knew which door to open, which desk to wipe down, which trash can to empty, without needing to think. The 11th floor. The conference room at the end of the hallway. The door should have been locked. She pressed the handle and it opened, and she stepped inside with her bucket and rag, then stopped. The room was dark. The lights were off. But someone was in there. She knew before her eyes had time to adjust, not because she saw him clearly, but because instinct told her. Because 7 years of living with a violent man had trained it into her nervous system, that ability to sense the presence of a man in a dark room before sight ever confirmed it. He was sitting at the head of the long conference table, in a swivel chair, back slightly reclined, one hand resting on the tabletop, the other on his thigh, and on the hand lying on the table there was blood. Not much, but enough for her to see the dark shine of it, under the thin spill of hallway light through the doorway. A shattered phone lay beside a wad of gauze. A broken liquor bottle sat in the corner of the room, the thick kind of bottle whose edges turn sharp as knives when it breaks. Briar stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. 3 seconds to assess. Blood, but not much. Not fatal. The man wasn't drunk. His eyes were open, fully aware, simply sitting there in the dark with his hand bleeding, wearing the calm of someone dealing with consequences, not someone in immediate danger, not her situation, not her problem, not her business. She knew that. She also knew she could close the door, clean the 10th floor first, and come back later. But Briar Holloway was the kind of woman who'd once nursed a dying dog she'd found in a trash bin, the kind who'd carried her daughter out of the hospital with one good arm, the kind whose first instinct at the sight of something wounded wasn't to run, but to assess the injury. She left the cleaning cart by the door, opened the lower compartment, took out the first aid kit the building required every cart to carry, and walked into the room. She pulled up a chair beside him, switched on the small desk lamp, took his hand in hers, not gently but practically, with the matter-of-fact grip of someone used to handling wounds because she'd bandaged enough of her own, and began wiping away the blood. He looked at her, She didn't look back. "Hold still," she said. "I don't have all day." She wrapped his hand. Fast, firm, done correctly with the skill of someone who hadn't learned first aid in a classroom, but from nights spent bandaging bruises in a mirror. When she finished, she stood up, gathered the first aid supplies, put them back into the cleaning cart, and didn't ask his name, didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask whether he needed anything else. She picked up the bucket and walked toward the door. "What's your name?" His voice, deep, not the kind of question people ask out of politeness, but the kind asked by a man who was taking note, filing away a piece of information, placing it exactly where it belonged, inside a system she didn't even know existed. She didn't turn around. "Briar," she said, and the sound of the cleaning cart wheels rolled farther and farther down the hallway on the 11th floor. Damon Moretti sat in the dark conference room with a hand that had just been bandaged by a thin woman with gray-blue eyes, steady hands, a cold voice, and the way she'd helped him without asking questions, without wanting anything, without waiting for thanks, the complete absence of calculation in that act, pulled on a thread somewhere deep in his memory, 7 years deep, all the way back to Precinct 4 at 2 a.m, where a 20-year-old girl, pregnant, her eyes bruised dark, had sat in front of a camera, while a police officer asked whether she'd seen who fired the gun. And that girl, with the whole world pressing down on her shoulders, and not one reason to protect a stranger, had looked straight into the camera and spoken 3 words that saved him from 25 years in prison. "I didn't see anything." He looked at the doorway she had just passed through. Briar, gray-blue eyes, old bruises long healed, but the way she held his hand still carried the traces of someone who'd been hurt too many times. He knew who she was now. She knew nothing about him. Not yet. Damon called Zane at 1 o'clock in the morning, 40 minutes after Briar Holloway had pushed her cleaning cart out of the conference room on the 11th floor and disappeared down the hallway without looking back a single time. The call lasted 11 seconds. Briar Holloway, find everything. That was all. Zane didn't ask why, because Zane never asked why. He asked how to spell the last name, then hung up, and 24 hours later, he was sitting across from Damon in the study of the estate, outside the city, reading from the report in a flat, toneless voice, the kind of voice used by a man who saw information as building material, not as story. Briar Holloway, 27 years old, single mother, daughter 6 years old, diagnosed with spastic cerebral palsy, wheelchair user, 2 jobs, income below the federal poverty line. No family, no relatives listed as emergency contact, no social support system, foster care from the age of 5 to 17, no criminal record. 1 dog, a 4-year-old purebred Neapolitan Mastiff, no official registration papers. And then, Reed Gallagher, 30 years old, the child's biological father, history of domestic violence that never led to prosecution because the victim didn't cooperate, gambling debt of $45,000, returned to Baltimore 2 weeks ago, has asked about Briar at no fewer than 3 locations in the Southridge neighborhood, has been seen near the little girl's school. He is targeting the dog. Zane delivered that last sentence in exactly the same voice as the first, the same flat tone, the same measured pace, but that sentence landed heavier than all the others before it. She has no one. Damon didn't speak. He sat behind the desk, his left hand still wrapped in the bandage Briar had tied the night before, and looked at Zane with an expression Zane, the most talkative man in the organization, couldn't find words to describe. "Put someone on Reed Gallagher," Damon said. 24 hours a day. Every contact, every movement, every call. Report directly to me. Zane nodded. "And her?" "Don't approach Briar." "Not yet." Silence. Not the brief kind that falls between 2 sentences, but the long kind. The kind that takes hold of an entire room and changes its temperature. Nico stood in the doorway, neither stepping in nor walking away, because Nico had been at Damon's side for 22 years, and he knew that Damon Moretti's silence wasn't the absence of words. It was the presence of something forming, tightening, searching for shape. The last time Nico had heard Damon go this quiet was 3 years earlier, on the night the doctor said Renata had 3 months left. That night, Damon had sat at this same desk, in this same room, and stayed silent for 40 minutes before rising and walking into the bedroom, where half the closet still held his wife's clothes, and stood there looking at Renata's dresses until morning came. 3 years had passed, and that closet still hadn't been cleared. Now Damon was silent in that same way again. And Nico understood. not through logic, but through 22 years of reading the same man, that whatever was taking shape inside this silence wasn't only the debt of 7 years owed to the girl who had said, "I didn't see anything." It was something else, something Nico didn't dare name, because naming it would make it real, and if it became real, everything would change. He had set his eyes on her, but he still didn't know that time wasn't on his side. 2 days after the night on the 11th floor, Briar was washing dishes after dinner when the knock came at the door. 9:15 at night. Posey was already asleep, her wheelchair folded in the corner beside the bed, Brutus lying in his fixed place between the bedroom door and the little girl's bed, 65 kilograms of steady breathing in the dark. No one knocked on this apartment door at 9 o'clock at night. No one knocked on this apartment door at any hour, because no one visited Briar Holloway, and no one visited Briar Holloway because Briar Holloway had no one. She set the plate down, wiped her hands on her pants, and walked to the door with the instincts of a woman who'd lived alone long enough to know that unexpected knocking rarely carried good news. She looked through the peephole, and 7 years came crashing down onto her shoulders like a wet blanket. Reed Gallagher stood in the hallway. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a smile. That smile. The smile she'd once believed in, once loved, once thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever possessed, until she understood it was a mask, and behind that mask was his hand on her throat, and the sound of the door shutting when he walked out, and the sound of her newborn daughter crying in an incubator he never once came back to see. He was holding a pink teddy bear, the cheap kind, bought from a dollar store, but wrapped carefully in a gift bag as though there were something meaningful inside it. Briar opened the door, because she knew that if she didn't, he'd keep standing there, and if he stood there long enough, the neighbors would notice, and if the neighbors noticed, someone would ask questions, and questions were one more thing her life didn't need. "Bree." His voice was sweet, sweet in the way artificial sugar is sweet, the kind of sweetness designed to taste real, but leaves a metallic aftertaste once it's swallowed. "It's been a long time. You doing okay? The little girl doing okay?" She stood in the doorway blocking the entrance, not inviting him in. "What do you want, Reed?" It wasn't a question. Her voice was flat, cold. The voice she'd spent 7 years building out of the ashes of the 20-year-old girl who once hadn't dared speak above a whisper when he was in the room. He didn't blink at that tone. He was used to cold women, because he believed cold was only the first layer, and underneath it there was always something he could use. "I want to see my daughter," he said, and his voice carried the fake weight of a man delivering lines he'd practiced. "I know I was wrong. I know I left. But I have rights, Bree. The law gives me rights." He pulled a packet of papers from his coat pocket, folded in half, official-looking, stamped-looking, bearing what looked like a lawyer's signature. He held them out to her. "Petition for visitation rights and reassessment of property, including registered animals purchased through my accounts and registered in my name for my daughter's use." His eyes, while his mouth talked about fatherhood and reconnecting and second chances, moved past her shoulder into the apartment and stopped on Brutus. The dog had gotten to his feet at some point. No one had heard him rise, because a 65-kilogram Neapolitan Mastiff, when he wanted to, could move with the silence of a shadow. He stood in the narrow hallway, between the front door where Reed was standing and the bedroom where Posey was sleeping, and he didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't step back, didn't move forward. He only stood there, a heavyweight shadow of absolute stillness, brown eyes fixed on Reed Gallagher, with the absolute calm of a creature that had chosen its ground and couldn't be moved from it by any force on earth. Reed looked at the dog. The dog looked back, and in those 3 seconds, the smile on Reed's face thinned, just a little, enough for Briar to see, enough for her to know he'd accounted for everything except 65 kilograms that didn't speak, didn't threaten, only stood. Briar looked at the papers. She'd been through enough systems in her life, enough courts, enough social service offices, enough caseworkers, to know what real paperwork looked like. And this wasn't it. The stamp was crooked. The case number used the wrong format. The court name was missing the county. She folded the papers and handed them back. "Fake," she said. "Get out of here." The mask didn't fall. He kept smiling, kept his voice sweet, still holding the teddy bear out toward her. "Bree, I just want to be a father. You never wanted to be a father. You want the dog. I saw the way you looked at him. Get out." She shut the door, fast, final, turned the deadbolt twice. and through the closed door she heard his footsteps going down the stairs. Slow, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who didn't treat a closed door as an ending, only as a delay. On the third step, or maybe the fourth, he stopped. His voice rose back up the stairwell, no longer sweet, no longer masked, no longer carrying a teddy bear. His real voice. The voice she remembered. The voice her body remembered. "Next time I won't knock." The footsteps continued down the stairs and disappeared. Briar stood behind the door, her back against the wood, her legs no longer strong enough to hold her, and she slid down until she was sitting on the cold kitchen floor. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears for Reed Gallagher 7 years ago, but she shook, and she hated it. Hated that her body still betrayed her every time it heard that voice. Hated that 7 years hadn't been enough to erase what he'd wired into her nervous system. Brutus came to her, silent, slow, his massive, heavy head lowering until it rested in her lap. Heavy, warm, utterly still. She placed her hand on his head and sat there on the cold kitchen floor, with 65 kilograms of dog across her knees, and darkness all around her, and she thought, more clearly than she had ever thought anything in her life, "I have no one." He said next time he wouldn't knock. He kept his word. 2 days after the night Reed knocked on her door, Briar picked Posey up from school at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just as she did every day. Brutus walked beside the wheelchair, just as he did every day, his shoulder brushing the frame, his head level with Posey's left hand, his steps slow and steady, and the vibrations of those steps traveled through the metal side of the chair into the little girl's palm, just as they did every day. Everything was the same as every other day, except for one thing. Posey felt it before Briar did, not with her eyes, not with her ears, but with her hand. Her left hand rested on Brutus's head, and that head changed. The muscles beneath the fur went rigid, his ears turned forward, his neck lifted slightly, and the vibrations from his steps passing through the wheelchair frame changed rhythm, no longer even, but shorter now, sharper, carrying the pattern of a creature shifting from ordinary into alert. Posey knew that difference. 4 years beside Brutus had taught her hand to read him the way fingers read Braille, and what her hand was reading now was 2 words. "Something's wrong. Mama." Posey spoke softly, but Briar didn't hear her, because Briar was looking straight ahead, seeing what Posey had already felt through her hand, 3 men standing at the intersection up ahead, not walking, not standing the way people stand waiting for the light, but standing the way people stand when they are waiting for something specific. And one of those 3 men had a face like Reed's, only younger, sharper, hotter. Troy Gallagher. Briar had never met Reed's younger brother, but she knew him at once from the jaw, the eyes, the forward lean of a man already halfway into violence and making no effort to hide it. Everything happened in the stretch of time that later Briar wouldn't remember in seconds, but in sounds. The first sound was heavy footsteps, fast, closing in from 3 directions. The second sound was Troy shouting something she didn't catch, because someone's hand shoved her away from the wheelchair handles, her shoulder slamming onto the sidewalk, her left knee striking concrete and flaring hot with pain. The third sound was Brutus. First the growl, low and deep, rising from the floor of his chest. A growl she had never once heard in 4 years, because Brutus had never needed to growl. Then the bite, the tearing cloth, Troy screaming in pain and swearing. The fourth sound was the pipe, metal against bone. Brutus, crying out. Not a bark, not a growl, a cry of pain. The cry of that giant, gentle soul taking a blow to the hip from an iron rod, and that sound traveled through the concrete into Posey's hand clamped tight around the wheelchair frame, and she felt it not with her ears but with her bones, with vibration, with the way the ground shuddered when the thing she loved most in the world was struck down. Posey didn't scream. Posey didn't cry out loud. Her body cried in its own way, the way cerebral palsy required it to, her whole body shaking, shaking from her shoulders down through her arms into her fingers, shaking in silence, shaking without making a sound, and that silence was more terrifying than any scream, because it was the sound of crying locked inside a body that wouldn't let it out. The fifth sound was the van door slamming shut, the engine, tires on asphalt, fading away. The sixth sound was nothing, nothing at all. Posey's left hand still rested on the side of the wheelchair where Brutus's head always was. And now in that place there was only air. No vibration, no warmth, no breathing, no familiar weight. Her hand closed over the empty metal rail and trembled. Briar crawled to Posey's wheelchair. Her left knee was bleeding, her shoulder screaming, but she crawled to her daughter before she stood up, because standing would take time, and Posey was shaking without sound, and that couldn't wait. She wrapped her arms around Posey from the front, reaching across the sides of the wheelchair, and Posey clung to her with tiny fingers twisted tight in her mother's shirt without being able to say a single word. The street stayed ordinary. People passing by looked, then looked away. One person stopped and asked if she was okay, and she said yes, though she wasn't. And that person kept going because they had somewhere to be, and Briar Holloway, sitting on the sidewalk with her trembling daughter in her arms, wasn't somewhere anyone needed to stay. She took out her phone, called the police. The phone rang 4 times, then dropped into hold music. 45 seconds of hold music. 45 seconds while Briar sat on the sidewalk with blood on her knee and her daughter shaking in her arms, listening to the hold music of the Baltimore Police Department. She hung up, looked at the phone. Her contacts were open, empty, no number to call, no name to ask, no one. She had built her life on the principle of needing no one, and now that principle had become true in the cruelest possible way. She really had no one. Posey was shaking in her arms. The wheelchair sat empty beside them. The sidewalk was warm beneath her bleeding knee, and the city kept moving as though nothing had happened. Because to the city, nothing had happened. Only a young mother sitting on the curb holding her disabled child. She had no one to call, but there was someone who didn't need to be called. 3 blocks north, inside the black sedan parked at the corner of Coronado and 7th, Zane Kovac's phone began to vibrate. One of Zane's men, the one assigned to keep Reed Gallagher under watch 24 hours a day, was calling in a report. But the report came 90 seconds too late because he had been following Reed, and Reed hadn't come. Troy had, and 90 seconds was the distance between stopping something and failing to stop it. Zane called Damon. 15 seconds. Not one wasted word. Briar Holloway, corner of Coronado and 5th. Troy Gallagher and 2 others just took the dog. White van heading east. She's on the sidewalk with the little girl. Alone. Silence on the other end. Not the long silence from the study that night. A short silence. 3 seconds. The kind of silence Zane, the most talkative man in the organization, recognized as the most dangerous kind, because it didn't mean Damon was still thinking. It meant Damon had already finished thinking. "I'll be there in 8 minutes. Call Nico." The call ended. 8 minutes. Later, Briar wouldn't know that number. She wouldn't know that Damon Moretti had driven from the estate outside the city to the corner of Coronado and 5th in 8 minutes, a stretch that normally took 25, and that he hadn't respected a single one of the 3 red lights on the way. She only knew that she was sitting on the sidewalk holding Posey, her knee still bleeding, her phone still in her hand with its empty contacts list open, and the city was still moving around her, when a black car pulled up to the curb in a way that wasn't parking, but arriving. The door opened before the car had fully stopped. The man who stepped out was the man from the dark conference room on the 11th floor. His left hand was wrapped in a clean, professional bandage. Yet he had refused to let his own doctors treat the wound she had first tended. But that night, he had been sitting in the dark, and she had seen him as vulnerable. And now he stood in the late afternoon light of Baltimore, and she saw what the darkness had hidden. He wasn't vulnerable. He was something else entirely. Something she had no word for in that moment, but her body recognized it before her mind did. Recognized it with that instinctive certainty that the man walking toward her wasn't the kind of man who sat waiting in a dark conference room because he had no one to help him, but the kind of man who chose to sit in the dark because the dark was where he worked. He didn't ask if she was all right. He came straight to her, and instead of standing over her and Posey the way adults always stood over wheelchairs, he bent down. One knee touched the sidewalk. His face came level with Posey's eyes, level with the height of the wheelchair, that height from which the whole world always looked down, but he chose to look across. Posey was still trembling. Her eyes, gray-blue like her mother's, were wide as she stared at the stranger with the expression of a child who had already endured too much in one afternoon to have strength left to fear one more person. He didn't touch her. He removed the watch from his right wrist, the kind of watch that was heavy, cold, expensive in the unmistakable way Briar recognized at once, because she had cleaned enough offices belonging to enough rich men to know what valuable watches looked like, and he placed it in Posey's hand. "My name is Damon. Hold this for me. I'll come back for it. I never leave my things behind." Posey looked at the watch in her hand. Heavy, cold, real. Her fingers closed around it, and the trembling stopped. Not completely, but enough. Damon rose and turned to Briar. And Briar, the woman who had bandaged his hand without asking his name, the woman who had walked away without looking back, looked at him with those hard gray blue eyes that now held something he hadn't seen in them that night. Fear. Not fear of him, fear of everything else. Why should I trust you? Her voice wasn't cold anymore. It was tired. Tired in the way of someone who had held everything together alone for too long and had just had the last thing keeping her upright torn away. Because 7 years ago, he said, you were sitting in Precinct 4 at 2 a.m. You were pregnant. Your face was bruised. And when they asked if you saw who fired the gun, you said, I didn't see anything. Those 3 words saved me from 25 years in prison. You didn't know who you were saving. You only wanted to go home. I know that, and I've been looking for you ever since. Briar looked at him. He looked back. No smile, no charm, no sweetness, only the truth, flat and heavy, laid down between them on the sidewalk, where 5 minutes earlier her daughter's dog had still been standing. I'm going to find Brutus, he said. Right now, I need you to go with Nico to somewhere safe for you and the little girl. A second sedan pulled up behind the first. Nico stepped out, large, bald, his face calm with the expression of a man who had been given orders and was carrying them out without needing anything explained. Briar looked at Nico, looked at Damon, looked down at Posey, her daughter holding the strange man's watch in both hands, and for the first time since Brutus had been taken, the child wasn't shaking anymore. Briar looked at the empty stretch of sidewalk where Brutus had stood 5 minutes earlier, where his shoulder had brushed the wheelchair, where the vibrations of his footsteps had traveled into her daughter's hand every morning. Empty. She stood up, put her hands on the handles of Posey's wheelchair, followed Nico. For the first time in 7 years, she walked behind a man. Not because she trusted him, because she had run out of places to go alone. Della Salerno opened the door before Nico even had the chance to knock, the way some people do when they've already gotten the call and have everything ready in the space between the call and the sound of the doorbell. She wasn't tall. She wasn't small. Her black hair was twisted into a neat knot at the nape of her neck. Her hands were steady, her eyes quick, the kind of eyes that swept across a room, took in the whole situation, and finished the assessment before her mouth had spoken its first word. 16 years of being Nico Salerno's wife, and the 12 years before that as an emergency room nurse, had taught Della something most people never learn. When someone's bleeding, you bandage first and ask later. Della looked at Briar's knee, looked at Posey in the wheelchair holding the watch in both hands, looked at Nico standing behind them with the expression she had seen often enough to know it meant, don't ask right now. Then stepped aside and said, come in, sit. Briar sat in one of the kitchen chairs, and Della knelt in front of her knee without being told, her hands already holding a first aid kit she had taken from the kitchen cabinet, not the medicine cabinet, because Della kept first aid supplies in the kitchen, where she used them most often, because in Nico Salerno's house, people sometimes came home with injuries that weren't convenient to explain, and Della had stopped asking for explanations in the 3rd year of their marriage. She cleaned the scrape, dabbed on antiseptic, wrapped it in fresh gauze, fast, firm, done properly, and through the whole thing she didn't ask Briar a single question about what had happened, because Della understood that there are moments when questions aren't care, they're weight. Posey sat at the kitchen table in her wheelchair. Damon's watch still clutched tight in her left hand, her right hand resting on the wooden tabletop. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, carefully, in the way Posey always observed the world, from the lower height of a wheelchair, reading a space through details instead of the whole. The wall clock ticked steadily. Something in a pot on the stove simmered low, bubbling softly. The smell of garlic browned in oil still hung in the air, mixed with dish soap and the scent of clean laundry drying near the window. This house smells like garlic and soap, Posey said in a small voice. The voice of a child saying something she didn't yet know carried more meaning than she understood. It smells like a house where people really live. Briar was sitting there while Della bandaged her knee, and she heard those words and understood. Understood in the way only a mother understands what her child means when her child says something else. That their 3rd-floor apartment in Southridge didn't smell like garlic frying in oil because Briar never had time to cook. Didn't smell like fragrant soap because Briar bought the cheapest, unscented kind. Only smelled like instant noodles and industrial floor cleaner she brought home from the night shift. And her 6-year-old daughter had just sat for the first time in her life in a kitchen that smelled like a real home and realized the difference. And that realization hurt more than any scrape on Briar's knee. Della didn't comment. She stood, went to the stove, reheated a pot of soup she'd already made, ladled a small bowl and set it in front of Posey with a mug of warm milk, then sat down in the chair across from her, with the easy certainty of someone who didn't need an invitation to know exactly where she belonged. Posey was safe. Brutus wasn't. And night was coming down. While Posey drank warm milk in Della's kitchen, Reed Gallagher's world began to shrink. He was sitting in a short-term rental apartment in East Baltimore, his feet up on the table, phone in hand, in a good mood because Troy had already called to say the job was done, the dog was at Mercer Warehouse, and Mercer had agreed to $45,000, which meant Reed could pay off the debt and still have some left over, which meant he had won, which meant coming back to Baltimore had been the right decision. The first message arrived at 6:12. Unknown number. No name. The text was short. Your attorney, Bernard Webb, is currently at Precinct 4 explaining the fake custody papers you used 2 days ago. Have a pleasant evening. Reed stared at the message. Read it once. Read it again. Read it a third time. He called Bernard Webb. Voicemail. Called again. Voicemail. Called a third time. And this time it wasn't voicemail, but the voice of an unfamiliar woman saying the number was temporarily unavailable. He set the phone down, picked it back up, called Troy. Troy didn't answer. Called again. No answer. Sent a text. Call me now. The message showed delivered, but not read. He began pacing the room, the pacing of a man who wasn't afraid yet, but was standing in the moment just before fear, that stage where the brain insists everything is fine, but the stomach doesn't agree. He needed cash. A backup plan always began with cash. He grabbed his jacket, went to the ATM on the corner, inserted his card, entered the code. The screen read, "Card locked. Please contact your bank." Second card, different account. "Card locked. Please contact your bank." He stood there at the ATM under the streetlight, and for the first time all day, his stomach won the argument with his brain. He was afraid. He went back to the apartment and called Mercer. Mercer picked up on the fifth ring, and Mercer's voice didn't sound like it had that morning, that easy voice counting future money. This voice was tight, fast, the voice of a man who wanted to end the conversation before it had truly begun. "Reed, I don't know who you crossed, but somebody just sent me a full list of every transaction I've made in the last 3 years. Everyone. Names, dates, amounts, buyers, along with one line only. You may want to reconsider your current business relationship. I don't know who that is and I don't want to know. Come get the dog out of my warehouse before 8 tonight. I don't keep trouble." The call ended. Reed called back. Mercer didn't answer. He sat on the bed and stared at the phone. And the world that had felt open that morning, the world that had still held a plan, still held money, still held a future, was now closing in around him at a speed he couldn't control, as if the walls themselves were moving inward. And he didn't understand who was doing this, didn't understand how, didn't understand why, and that not understanding was the most frightening thing of all, because Reed Gallagher feared many things, but the thing he feared most was an enemy he couldn't see. At the same time, on the west side of the city, Troy Gallagher was sitting in a cheap bar on Pratt Street, his right hand wrapped in a rough bandage, because Brutus's bite was still seeping through the cloth, and he was drinking beer with his left hand, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had finished a job and was now rewarding himself. He went into the restroom. 2 minutes. When he came back out, Nico Salerno was sitting at his table. Troy's beer was still there. Beside a cup of coffee Nico had ordered in the 2 minutes Troy was gone, and Nico was drinking that coffee with the easy calm of a man sitting in his regular place. Except this wasn't Nico's regular place, and that cup of coffee wasn't why Nico was there. Troy looked at Nico, looked at the leather jacket, looked at the hands resting on the table. Large, thick, covered in tattoos. The kind of hands that told their own story before they ever moved. Looked around the bar, crowded, ordinary, nobody watching them. And that ordinariness was what made it truly frightening, because it meant Nico could sit here in the middle of a crowd and nobody knew, and nobody dared know. "Troy Gallagher," Nico said, his voice ordinary, almost friendly, the kind of voice a man might use to read a menu instead of a sentence. 28 years old, history of assault, petty theft, violation of a protection order twice, right hand got bitten by a dog about 3 hours ago. Bet that hurts. Troy said nothing. His left hand, the one holding the beer, lowered slowly to the table. "You've got two choices," Nico said, still in that same voice, still drinking his coffee. "One, you tell me where the dog is, leave Baltimore tonight, and don't come back. Simple, clean. You go, I forget, everybody keeps living. 2, you don't tell me, you stay. And starting tomorrow, everything you touch in this city starts having problems. Money, housing, work, friends, people you know. I won't hit you. I won't need to." Nico took another drink of coffee, set the cup down, looked at Troy with the perfectly patient eyes of a man who had the whole night ahead of him and no reason to rush anywhere. Troy looked at Nico, looked at his own bitten hand, still leaking blood through the bandage, looked at the beer glass, and he understood, with the street instinct 28 years had hammered into him, that the man sitting across from him wasn't the kind who made threats and let them fade away. This was the kind who said a thing and then did it. "Mercer Warehouse," Troy said. "Meridian South, past the tracks, blue door on the east side." Nico nodded, stood up, left money for the coffee on the table along with a generous tip, and walked out without looking back. Nico had the address. Damon had a plan. Reed had nothing. Mercer Warehouse stood at the end of Meridian South, past the railroad tracks, with the blue door on the east side exactly where Troy had said it would be. Damon arrived at 7:42, 20 minutes before the 8 o'clock deadline Mercer had given Reed. Nico parked at the mouth of the alley. Zane took the far end. 2 other men waited by the tracks. No one went in. Damon went in alone. Not because he had anything to prove, but because what he had come to take back wasn't cargo that needed a team to carry it out. It was a dog, and that dog belonged to a 6-year-old girl in a wheelchair who was holding his watch in both hands in Della's kitchen. And that fact, in some way Damon didn't analyze but only felt, required him to walk in there himself. The warehouse was smaller than he had expected. It smelled of damp air, dog, wet concrete, and the sour, sharp smell of fear that comes from animals being kept too long in a space too small. Cages lined both walls, 6 or 7 of them, most with dogs inside, thin, filthy, some barking when he entered, some backing deeper into the corners of their cages. The last cage, the largest one, stood in the far corner. Brutus lay inside it. A chain looped around his neck and fastened to the steel bar at the back of the cage. A leather muzzle was strapped tight around his jaws. His left hip was bruised, the fur around it matted stiff with dried blood, and the dog lay still, eyes open, watching the door, not barking, not scratching, not thrashing, not panicked, lying in the middle of the cage, head slightly raised, brown eyes fixed on the warehouse entrance, waiting with the absolute patience of a creature who had spent 4 years beside a little girl in a wheelchair and had learned that waiting was part of the job, that waiting was loyalty, that waiting was how things that belonged to each other found their way back. Reed Gallagher was standing in front of Brutus's cage when Damon walked in. He had arrived first, just as Mercer had demanded, to get the dog out before 8 o'clock, and he was fumbling with the cage lock with a hand that shook, because his ATM cards had been frozen, and his lawyer had been taken in, and Troy wasn't answering his phone, and the whole world was collapsing around him, and he still didn't understand why. He heard footsteps and turned, and saw Damon Moretti standing in the warehouse doorway. There was nothing dramatic about the way Damon stood. He stood straight, both hands at his sides, not crossing his arms, not putting his hands in his pockets, not leaning against anything, but he filled the doorway with a kind of completeness that required no effort, the way certain men take possession of a space not through size, but through weight, through something they carry into a room that no one can see and everyone can feel. "Reed Gallagher," Damon said. His voice was low, slow, ordinary. No shouting, no threat, no raised tone. The voice of a man speaking the truth, and truth doesn't need volume. 30 years old, $45,000 in gambling debt, history of domestic violence that never led to charges because the victim didn't cooperate. Biological father of a 6-year-old girl with spastic cerebral palsy, whom you've never once held. Reed opened his mouth. Damon didn't stop. "You beat the little girl's mother while she was pregnant. You walked away when your daughter was born, and the doctors said she would never walk. 7 years. Not one call, not $1, not one time asking how the little girl was breathing, what she was eating, where she was sleeping, who pushed her wheelchair every morning. Each sentence was a fact, no adjectives, no judgment, only facts, one after another, precise, cold, And that coldness was what made it cruel. Because judgment can be argued with. Facts can't. And you came back, Damon said. Not for your daughter. For the dog. Because a purebred dog like that is worth $45,000 on the black market. And you happen to owe almost exactly that amount. Reed stepped back. Not because of fear. Because of reflex. Because every word Damon spoke was taking up space in the room, and that space was pushing him out of it. Do you know what that dog does? Damon asked, and for the first time his voice changed. Not louder, but denser, heavier. The way a liquid turns solid. It pushes your daughter's wheelchair every morning with its head. It lies beside her bed every night, between her bedroom door and the rest of the world. 65 kilograms standing guard over a child. Her own father never bothered to guard. It is the legs she doesn't have. It is the only thing in this world that has never looked at her with pity. Damon stopped, looked at Reed. You took your own daughter's legs to pay a gambling debt. Reed opened his mouth again. That is property. I lost my wife 3 years ago, Damon said, and this sentence was different from all the others. This wasn't a cold fact. This sentence carried its own weight, the weight of 3 years of an empty bed and half a closet still hanging full of clothes, and nights when the silence inside the house had grown so thick it nearly seemed to have shape. Cancer. I sat beside her for 7 months. I watched her go. I couldn't do anything. I had no choice. He looked at Reed with dark brown eyes that under the warehouse light seemed almost black. You had a choice. You had a daughter alive, breathing, sitting there waiting for you, and you chose the dog. Silence. The warehouse was silent except for the breathing of dogs inside cages and the drip of water somewhere in the old plumbing. Reed stood there in the middle of the warehouse, and on his face, underneath all the layers, underneath the confidence, underneath the self-justification, underneath the I have rights and that is property, and she never gave me a chance. Something cracked, not shattered. Reed Gallagher wasn't the kind of man truth shattered all at once, but cracked. A small fracture somewhere behind his eyes, in the place where he had buried the thing he never let himself look at, the thing he had spent 7 years trying to keep underground, and now a stranger was standing in a dog warehouse digging it back up with facts, only facts, without needing a fist. Damon didn't hit him. He didn't need to. Some things hurt worse than fists. Damon knelt in front of Brutus's cage and unlocked it. He removed the chain from around the dog's neck first, slowly, carefully, because the metal had bitten deep into the fur and left the skin underneath marked red. Then he took off the muzzle, one buckle at a time. And when the last strip of leather came free from the dog's jaws, Brutus didn't leap out, didn't bark, didn't lunge for the door. He sat up inside the cage, slowly because his left hip hurt, and looked at Damon. Then he lifted his nose toward Damon's left hand, the hand Briar had bandaged. Though the gauze was fresh, the dog's keen nose found her lingering scent on the man's skin, and deep within the fibers, a scent he knew better than his own. Long, carefully, his wet nose touched the gauze, and Damon stayed still, letting him smell, because he understood, not through knowledge but through instinct, that the dog was reading his hand with his nose, searching the scent in that bandage for something familiar, something that connected him to the person he had been waiting for. Briar's scent clinging to his skin, the scent of her skin, her cheap soap, the sweat of the night shift, the scent of the woman who had bandaged his hand without asking his name. Brutus finished sniffing. His tail wagged. Once, slow and heavy. Then he stepped out of the cage, leaning slightly to the right because his left hip couldn't carry weight well, and walked past Damon, past the other dog cages, past Reed, who was still standing there without saying a word, through the warehouse door, out into the alley, and turned left. He knew the way. No one pointed. No one led. 4 years of walking beside Posey's wheelchair through every street in that neighborhood had drawn a map inside his head, and that map didn't need sight, only scent and the memory of a creature who had loved deeply enough to remember the road home with whatever senses still worked. Damon followed him. Nico drove slowly behind them. No one said a word. Brutus walked 12 blocks with a gait slightly uneven from the pain in his hip, and Damon walked 12 blocks behind a 65-kilogram dog making his way home. And he thought that here was a creature who had been struck across the hip with a metal rod, chained, muzzled, locked in a dark cage all afternoon, and his first response when freed wasn't fear, wasn't anger, but home. Go home to his own. Nico's house. 9:17 that night. Della stood at the sink, washing a bowl that was already clean for the third time because her hands needed something to do. Briar sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door with the stare of a woman waiting for something without which she didn't know how she would keep breathing. Posey sat in her wheelchair beside the table, still holding Damon's watch in her left hand, her right hand resting on the wooden tabletop. The wall clock ticked. The smell of browned garlic had gone cool but still lingered in the air. Yellow light, the same kitchen where, only a few hours earlier, Posey had said this house smelled like people really lived in it. The sound of a car stopping outside, the sound of the car door, then footsteps. Posey felt them before she heard them. The vibrations traveled through the front steps, through the wood floor of the hallway, through the legs of the kitchen table, into the tabletop, into the palm of her right hand resting on the wood. Heavy, slow, slightly uneven, the right step shorter than the left because the left hip hurt. She knew. She didn't need to look, didn't need to hear, only needed her hand on the table, and the vibration moving through the wood, and 4 years of memory of that rhythm under her hand every morning through the frame of her wheelchair. That rhythm, that weight, slightly off because of pain, but right, completely right. Brutus. The kitchen door opened. 65 kilograms of Neapolitan Mastiff stepped in, face wrinkled, drool hanging, hip bruised, gait tilted, and walked straight to Posey's wheelchair. He didn't stop at the door, didn't look around, didn't sniff the unfamiliar kitchen. He went straight to the little girl and laid his head in her lap. Exactly there. Exactly that weight. Exactly that warm breath through the fabric over her legs. Posey placed both hands on his head. Her left hand let go of the watch into her lap so she could take hold of his ear, and her right hand rested on his forehead, and she bent down, pressed her face into the fur at his neck, and breathed. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She breathed. Deep breaths, slow breaths. The kind of breathing a person does when the thing without which her lungs haven't worked properly all afternoon has just been returned to her. Briar stood beside the table, both hands over her mouth. And she cried. She cried the way her daughter cried. The way Posey had cried on the sidewalk that afternoon. Her whole body shaking without making a sound. Because maybe the way people cry is inherited, or maybe two people who have lived beside each other long enough begin to hurt in the same language. Damon stood in the kitchen doorway. He didn't come in. He stepped back into the hall, leaned against the wall, and closed his eyes. 1 second. 1 single second in which he allowed himself not to control his expression, not to be Damon Moretti who controlled the south side of Baltimore, only a man standing in somebody else's hallway and remembering what it looked like when something lost was found again, because he had lost and never found again, and watching somebody else recover what he himself had lost hurt, in a place he had believed had sealed shut 3 years before. Della stood at the sink, holding a dish that was already clean, not washing it, her eyes fixed on Posey with Brutus's head in her lap, and Della's hand trembled. Only a little. But it trembled. Then Posey lifted her face, dog fur still clinging to her skin, and looked toward the kitchen doorway where Damon stood in the hall. From the height of the wheelchair, her gaze reached only as high as his waist, and she saw his hands hanging at his sides, his fingers closing and opening, that small unconscious motion, the motion of a man holding something inside himself and not letting it come out. He hurts too, Posey said softly, her voice still warm with Brutus's breath across her lap. Not in his hip. No one in that kitchen said another word. There are moments when language only makes smaller what is happening. In the weeks after the night Brutus came home, Damon didn't disappear. He didn't push, either. He was there in the way some things are there, not moving toward you, but whenever you look up, always in the same place. The new wheelchair appeared outside Briar's apartment door on Monday morning of the second week, with no card, no note, no explanation. Lighter than the old one. Rubber wheels instead of plastic, an alloy frame instead of rusted iron, padded armrests. Briar looked at the wheelchair, then looked out at the street where no black sedan was parked, but she knew someone was aware that she was looking, and she pulled the chair inside with every intention of calling Damon and sending it back, because Briar Holloway didn't take things from people, didn't owe people, didn't depend on people. That was the principle she had built over 7 years, with an aching back and calloused hands and nights spent working 2 shifts. But Posey saw the wheelchair before Briar could hide it away, and Posey touched the wheels, touched the armrests, and Brutus came over and rested his head against the side of the new chair, in exactly the right place, exactly the right height. as if the chair had been measured for him in advance. And Posey said in that small, solemn voice of a 6-year-old making an argument she believed couldn't possibly be answered, "Mama, this one is lighter. Brutus can push it easier. You want Brutus to get tired?" Briar looked at her daughter, looked at the chair, looked at Brutus with his head resting against the frame in the satisfied way of a creature that had found his proper place. She lost. She knew she lost. She had been defeated by a 6-year-old child and a 65-kilogram dog, and she had no argument against that logic. The wheelchair stayed. Damon began coming to dinner. Not every night. Tuesdays and Fridays. Nothing romantic, no candles, no wine. He sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment she had now moved into. Cleaner, warmer, with a separate room for Posey, a place Nico had found, and Damon had paid the first 3 months for, which Briar accepted only after 2 weeks of refusing, because Posey needed the health insurance tied to the new lease. He ate whatever Briar cooked without comment, and he talked to Posey, truly talked to her. Not the way adults talk to children with high voices and simplified words, but the way he spoke to everyone. Level, direct, serious. Posey asked about cars, and he answered with technical detail she didn't fully understand, but listened to with complete fascination, because no one had ever spoken to her like this before, as if he were giving a report to a board of directors, and she were a member of the board. Posey read books aloud to him, slowly, laboriously, because the muscles of her mouth didn't always cooperate with her mind. And he sat there listening without correcting her, without hurrying her, without glancing at his watch, without showing the slightest impatience, simply listening, with the patience of a man who had sat beside his wife's bed for 7 months and learned that being present matters more than speaking. The moment when the wall Briar had spent 7 years building truly cracked wasn't a large moment, not a sentence, not an action. It was one evening when she came home from work earlier than usual, opened the apartment door, and saw Damon Moretti, the mafia boss of South Baltimore, sitting on the living room floor, on the floor. Because Posey wanted to play on the floor, and Brutus was lying on the floor, and Damon, the kind of man who walked into a room and made the room rearrange itself around him, was sitting on the dirty floor of a cheap apartment with 65 kilograms of dog resting his head in Damon's lap, and Posey leaning against Brutus's side reading a book in her slow, difficult voice. And Damon sat there without moving, a cup of coffee gone cold on the floor beside his knee, and listened. Briar stood in the doorway for a very long time, without stepping inside. That night, Posey was asleep, Brutus beside her bed, and Briar and Damon sat on the tiny balcony of the new apartment, the kind of balcony with room for only 2 plastic chairs and just enough distance between them so that the people sitting there didn't touch. Baltimore at night. Streetlights. The far-off sound of traffic. The salty river smell riding in on the wind. "Why?" Briar asked. Her voice wasn't cold anymore, wasn't tired anymore, only honest. "I said those 3 words 7 years ago because I wanted to get out of that police station. I didn't save you. I saved myself." "I know," Damon said. He looked out over the city, and that's the reason. Because you weren't calculating. You didn't know who I was. You got nothing from it. My whole life, everything has a price. Everyone who helps me sends a bill. That night was the only time anyone ever gave me something and asked for nothing in return." Silence. Wind from the river. Streetlights flickering. "And I watch your daughter hold that dog every night," he said, his voice lower now, so low it was almost private, the kind of voice Briar suspected very few people ever heard from him. "And I watch you work 2 shifts a day to keep that little family alive. And I see something I thought I wasn't capable of recognizing anymore after Renata died." "What?" "A place to belong." Briar didn't speak. She didn't reach over and place her hand on his where it rested on the arm of the plastic chair. She wasn't ready for that gesture yet. Wasn't ready for any gesture that would break the distance between those 2 chairs. Because 7 years of building walls doesn't come undone in a single night, no matter how beautiful the night may be. But she didn't stand up, either. She stayed, sitting quietly beside him on that tiny balcony overlooking the dark city. Not everything yet, but enough. 3 months later. Tuesday morning, 6:30. Briar Holloway opened her eyes, and for the first time in 7 years, the alarm clock rang before she woke. Not because she had overslept, but because she no longer needed to get up at 5:45. One job, a day shift, health insurance, days off, A paycheck large enough that when she received the first month's deposit, she sat staring at the number in her account for 3 full minutes because she wasn't used to seeing a balance that wasn't negative. The new apartment was clean, warm, and had a room of her own for Posey, with a window looking out at the maple tree on the corner, where in autumn the leaves turned gold, and Posey said they looked like the color of Brutus's fur when the sun hit it. Brutus lay beside Posey's bed, still between the door and the bed, still in that place. He would always be in that place, because some things in his instincts had been written long ago, and nothing in this world was ever going to rewrite them. The road to school was still 4 blocks. Posey in the new wheelchair, lighter, smoother, Brutus pushing with his head, his shoulder brushing the frame, the familiar vibrations traveling into the little girl's hand. Mrs. Yoon still stood outside the vegetable store, blue slippers, the smell of basil, slipping a red apple into Posey's hand every morning and never once taking money for it. The old man on the corner still wore cracked heel boots, still smelled of cigarettes, still nodded as they passed. Everything was like every other day. Except for one thing. The black sedan parked on the corner, never there long enough to become ordinary, but always there long enough for Briar to know. Nico drank coffee at Mrs. Pham's diner every Tuesday and Thursday morning. And Mrs. Pham told Briar in a voice balanced somewhere between complaint and satisfaction. He drinks too much, but he tips good, so I don't throw him out. Zane knew Posey's school schedule, Briar's work hours, the name of the physical therapist, the teacher's name, recess time. No one had asked him to remember it all. He remembered because that was how Zane worked, and because Damon never said it out loud, but the whole organization understood. That woman and that little girl and that dog were protected, quietly, completely, without negotiation. At school, Posey's teacher asked her, because she had heard whispers from the other parents. The kind of whispers people hear when a black sedan keeps parking near the school every morning. Posey, what is Mr. Damon to you? Posey thought. For a long time, seriously, the way Posey thought about everything, without rushing, without guessing, only searching for the most accurate answer. I don't know yet, she said. But he comes to dinner. He listens when I read and doesn't hurry me. He doesn't smile much, but he sits on the floor so I don't have to look up at him. And he doesn't go anywhere. She paused for a second, like Brutus. The teacher didn't ask anything more. Some answers don't need adults to explain them further because the child has already said enough. In the office at the estate outside Baltimore, on Damon Moretti's desk, there were 2 things. Renata's photograph in its silver frame, taken on their wedding day, her smiling, her hair caught by the wind, and him standing beside her with the expression of a man who couldn't believe he had been allowed that much luck. That photograph had stood alone on the desk for 3 years. Now, beside it, sat the watch. The watch he had handed Posey on the sidewalk that afternoon. The one she had held in both hands and stopped trembling. The one she had returned after Brutus came home because he had said he would come back for it. And he had come back. He placed it on the desk beside Renata's picture, and never explained why. Nico came into the office one morning, saw the 2 things standing side by side, and Nico, who had followed Damon for 22 years, understood. For the first time in 3 years, Renata's photograph was no longer standing alone. 2 weeks after the night at the warehouse, information about Mercer's dog trafficking operation reached a local investigative reporter through an anonymous source. The story ran. Police opened an investigation. Mercer was arrested. Reed Gallagher was arrested too, not only for the dog theft, but because the domestic violence file was reopened, the fake custody papers were prosecuted, and the gambling debt was tied to an illegal network. Troy left Baltimore the very night Nico sat at his table in the bar, and nobody went looking for him. 12 dogs from Mercer Warehouse were transferred to rescue organizations, examined, treated, and placed in new homes. Not one newspaper line, not one news segment, not one police officer connected any of it to Damon Moretti. The reporter had a good source. The police had a clean case. Everyone was satisfied. Brutus sat in the schoolyard beside Posey's wheelchair, his head level with her hand, calm brown eyes watching the world pass by. Children ran past. Some were afraid because he was so big. Some stopped to stare because he was strange. And Posey sat beside him with the same calm he carried, her left hand resting on his head, her right hand on the side of the wheelchair, and his tail wagged. Slow, heavy, certain. that steady rhythm like the breathing of something completely content. He didn't comment. He rarely commented. He had always understood that some things didn't need anything added to them. This story is about a single mother who had no one. A little girl in a wheelchair accustomed to the world's condescending stares and tragic sighs. A dog abandoned in a trash bin who became the legs of a child who couldn't walk. And a man the world called the devil, who turned out to be the only one who knelt down to wheelchair eye level instead of looking from above. Sometimes the fiercest protection doesn't come from systems. It doesn't come from the law. It comes from someone who is lost enough to understand the value of what another person is still holding on to. Sometimes family isn't the thing you're born into, but the thing that finds you at exactly the moment you've stopped believing anyone is coming. And sometimes love doesn't need to be spoken aloud. Sometimes it only needs a heavy head settling into your lap every night and never leaving. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button so we'll know you were here and that you listened. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it tonight, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way someone looks at tomorrow. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the time, because we tell stories like this every day, and we don't want you to miss them. We'd truly love to hear what you felt, what this story stirred inside you. Whether you've ever met someone like Briar in real life, whether you believe kindness without reason can change a life, leave a comment below. We read every line and treasure every word you share from the bottom of your hearts. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.